Today, we're going to be looking at 9.4, Reforming the Industrial World. If we remember to the previous unit on the spread of industrialization, we looked at how industrialization started in Great Britain. It eventually expanded into continental Europe as well as the United States. And this is where we start to see the rise of class tensions. Setting the stage. So, with the Industrial Revolution, there was an increase in the gap between the very rich and the very poor. When we're going through this unit, we want to think about what role should the government play in business and economic affairs. And by the end, we're going to be looking at how reformers pushed for the improvement, protection, and rights of individuals. We're going to be looking at a few philosophers. The first one is Adam Smith, but before we can get into Adam Smith, we have to talk about laissez-faire economics. So, this is an economic policy of letting owners of industry and business set working conditions without any sort of interference. It favors a free market and believes that if the government allowed free trade, a market without government regulation would prosper. So, Adam Smith was a philosopher. He wrote The Wealth of the Nation, and he supported a free market. He believed in economic liberty would guarantee economic progress. And he had a few laws that he came up with. The first one is the law of self interest. People work for their own good. The law of competition. Competition forces people to make a better product. The law of supply and demand. Enough goods would be produced at the lowest possible price to meet demand in a market economy. These are some examples of traits that would be in a free market. For an example, free to compete, be an entrepreneur, an investor, choose your work, and also buy, own, use, and sell private property. That gets us into capitalism. Capitalism is also an economic system in which factors of production are privately owned and the money is invested in businesses to make a profit. The idea helped create and kind of spur the Industrial Revolution. It opposes government efforts to help poor workers. The idea behind this and creating a minimum wage job and better work conditions ultimately would upset a free market system. It would lower profits and undermine the product of wealth. So again, it's a system that is privately owned by business seeking profits. One person that we're going to look at is Thomas Malthus, and he thinks that populations grow faster than the food supply. So he believes that wars, epidemics, and famine could control the population. And we can skip the other people that are on this slide. We see the rise of socialism. This isn't when factors of production are owned by, operated for the people. Socialists think that the government can ultimately control and end poverty and bring equality. And this essentially grew out of the belief of and this desire for social justice. One person that we're going to be looking at is Karl Marx. He was a German writer and he wrote the Communist Manifesto. And he had this belief, it was very radical socialism. He believed that human societies will always be divided up into these warring social classes, and these are the haves and the have nots. The haves are the middle class employers, and they are also known as the bourgeoisie, whereas the have nots are the workers, also the proletariats, which we've discussed. We can get into this a little bit later. Um, a few key differences between communism and capitalism. So, in communism, there's no class distinction, whereas with capitalism, there is. Communism has a production for basic needs, whereas capitalism is a production for profit. And if we look at this chart, we can also see the difference between capitalism and communism. You might hear the terms free economy versus a command economy. In a capitalist free market economy, it's the people who determine the price, supply, and demand of a product. Whereas in a communist or command economy, it's the government that determines price, supply, demand of a product. So, what are a few things that are good about communism? Is that it provides security, basic needs are met, everyone has a job, house, and health care. And there's none of the survival of the fittest problem here. But again, on the flip side, there's a lack of choice. There's no reward for being a better worker. Slackers don't receive punishment. So there's this lack of incentive to work harder. And everyone is expected to be the same. So there's no sort of individual growth. So the future, according to Marx, he believed that the capitalist system would destroy itself. It would ultimately drive out small businesses, small shops. You would see that the working class would ultimately revolt, and it's the workers who would bring economic equality for the people. He then thinks that the workers would control the government, and we would then see this breakdown in social classes. So, again, communism is when the means of production are owned by the people, private property wouldn't exist, and goods and services are shared equally. So, at this time during the Industrial Revolution, kind of the tail end, we do see a rise of labor unions. So, workers would join together to form unions. They would work together in bargaining, better work conditions, higher pay. And at times they would use strikes, and that's a refusal of work. But ultimately, strikes and unions are outlawed. We also see labor reforms. So there's an investigation of child labor, and that's the Factory Act. Um, Children from 13 to 17 can't work more than 12 hours. The Mines Act prevented women and children from working underground. And the 10-Hour Act limited the workday to 10 hours for women and children. And we also see other reforms that are taking place. Slavery is ended in the Western Hemisphere by the late 1800s. We see a reform in women's rights, so more opportunities, higher wages. We start to see these safer work conditions. Education, there's free public education for children. And then there's also prison reforms.